Imagine a world united by one flag, one army, one law. From the windswept cliffs of Britain to the scorching sands of Arabia, Rome ruled all. Roads stretched for thousands of miles. Legions held the frontiers. Marble temples honored gods and emperors alike. To the average Roman citizen, it must have felt eternal, immortal. But history is not made only by swords and emperors. Sometimes it's shaped by things no one can see. No battlefield, no army, just a breath, a cough, a fever. In the golden glow of the 2nd century, when the empire was at its peak, Rome's real enemy was already marching, silently, invisibly, through the veins of returning soldiers. They came home from the east, not just with victory, but with plague. And from there, everything began to unravel. This is the story of how a microscopic invader helped bring down the greatest empire the world had ever known. A story of 2 pandemics, 2 emperors, and 1 irreversible collapse. This is the plague that killed Rome. It began in 165 AD. Roman legions had just returned from a victorious campaign against the Parthians, but they brought home more than spoils. Soldiers fell ill, camps turned into morgues, cities into tombs. The Antonine Plague, as it would later be known, ripped through the empire like wildfire. Within weeks, entire towns were infected. People dropped in the streets. Doctors were powerless. Priests begged the gods for mercy. Nothing worked. The symptoms were horrifying. Fever, vomiting, skin lesions, unbearable pain. The disease didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, citizen or slave, senator or soldier, death came quickly. At its peak, thousands died every single day in Rome alone. The streets were lined with corpses. The Tiber ran red with the ashes of the dead. Families disappeared. Entire villages vanished from maps. The empire's response? Panic. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, known as the Philosopher King, tried to hold the empire together. He wrote about duty and endurance even as he buried his children. He watched his generals die, his armies thin, and his economy crumble. With so many dead, the army was desperate. Gladiators were recruited as soldiers. Slaves were armed and sent to the front. Foreign mercenaries filled the gaps. But morale plummeted. Loyalty faded. Discipline shattered. The war in the north continued. Germanic tribes tested the weakened frontier, and with every campaign, the disease followed. It wasn't just killing bodies, it was killing trust. Killing systems, killing Rome from within. A few generations later, the empire was hit again. In the year 250 AD, a new disease emerged, more brutal, more terrifying. It began in Africa and spread fast, through Carthage, Alexandria, and straight into Rome. This time, the death toll was even worse. This was the Plague of Cyprian. Eyewitnesses described scenes of apocalyptic horror, people bleeding from their eyes and mouths, vomiting blood, limbs blackened with rot, entire neighborhoods abandoned, dead bodies piled in the streets, left for wild dogs. City after city collapsed, crops went unharvested, markets shut down, water systems failed. In some places, half the population vanished in months, and this plague didn't just kill people, it killed the empire's last grip on control. Rome was already fragile. By 250 AD, civil wars were common, the economy was collapsing, armies were rebelling, emperors were being murdered one after another. The plague was the final weight that broke the system. In just 50 years, more than 20 emperors rose and fell. Most were assassinated. None ruled long enough to fix anything. At the frontiers, legions crumbled. In the cities, governors deserted their posts. In the countryside, peasants fled into the forests or joined bandit gangs. Order gave way to chaos. It wasn't just a pandemic, it was a civilizational shock. In the midst of all this death, something strange happened. A new faith began to rise. Christianity, once a fringe, outlawed movement, suddenly started to grow. Not because of miracles, not because of politics, but because of how Christians responded to the plague. While pagan priests abandoned their temples, Christians stayed. They cared for the sick. They fed the hungry. They buried the dead. Sometimes even those who weren't part of their faith. And in a world where death was everywhere, their message of eternal life found an audience. People were desperate. The gods of old had failed. Rome had failed. But the Christians offered hope, not just in the next life, but in this one. Communities formed around churches, bishops became leaders, faith became survival. By the end of the 3rd century, Christianity wasn't just tolerated, it was thriving. And the plague, in a strange way, had made it possible, but it also deepened the cultural divide. Rome was no longer united by tradition. It was divided: pagan versus Christian, rich versus poor, city versus country. The plague hadn't just broken bodies, it had broken identity. As the population fell, the economy followed. There were fewer workers. Farms were abandoned, mines shut down, trade routes dried up, cities shrank. Some disappeared altogether. To pay for the army, emperors debased the currency, reducing silver content in coins until they were practically worthless. Inflation exploded. Prices skyrocketed. Bread that once cost a single coin now cost 100. Merchants refused Roman money altogether. Barter returned. Taxes rose, harder and harder. Even in times of famine, the empire demanded tribute. When people couldn't pay, their land was taken. Some were forced into debt slavery. Others fled. Entire towns emptied out to avoid tax collectors. Provinces stopped sending grain. Rome, once fed by its empire, began to starve. Meanwhile, the army transformed. There were too few Romans left willing to fight. So the empire hired outsiders, barbarian tribes who fought for pay, not loyalty. The Visigoths, Vandals, Franks. Rome's enemies became its protectors, but protectors don't stay loyal forever. Barbarian generals began to rise in power. They led legions, they held titles, they made demands, and when Rome couldn't pay, they took. Everything was failing at once: disease, war, inflation, famine, religious division, political chaos. This was more than a plague. It was a perfect storm, a polycrisis. Rome had always weathered storms before, but now the systems were too fragile, the population too small, the economy too unstable, the army too unreliable. The great cities of the empire, Carthage, Antioch, Alexandria, saw their populations cut in half or worse. Civic pride vanished. Infrastructure fell apart. Aqueducts dried up. Baths closed. Forums crumbled. Even in Rome, the eternal city, the streets grew quiet. Statues toppled. The Senate became irrelevant. Emperors came and went like shadows. Some ruled for weeks. Others never even made it to the capital before being killed. Diocletian, one of the few strong rulers left, tried to reform everything. He split the empire into east and west, created new provinces, set price controls, declared himself a living god. But even he couldn't stop what had already begun. The empire wasn't dying. It was already dead. It just hadn't been buried yet. In 410 AD, something unthinkable happened. Rome, the center of the world for centuries, was sacked, burned, pillaged, not by a great empire, not by an army of equals, but by Alaric and his Visigoths, former allies, former protectors, now conquerors. The eternal city fell to men it had once hired. And Rome didn't rise again. Yes, the Eastern Empire survived as Byzantium. Yes, Constantinople stood for another 1,000 years. But the Rome of old, the Rome of Caesar and Cicero, of legions and laws, was gone. Not because of one battle, not because of one emperor, but because of plague. Plague that killed millions, that broke systems, that divided faiths, that hollowed out cities, that left fields fallow and borders open, that destroyed trust and fueled chaos. Rome didn't fall in a moment. It fell in waves of fever, of death, of silence. In the end, the empire that ruled the known world was brought down, not by armies or invasions, but by something too small to see. Something that lived in the breath, something that lived in the blood. The greatest empire in history was killed by a plague.